Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Demystifying Trust-Based Philanthropy, the sixth session in our series, the session titled, What Does Racial Equity Have to Do with Trust-Based Philanthropy? So excited to be here with you all and so glad you could join us. My name is Shantia Ford, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. As a visual descriptor, I am a Black woman sitting in front of a white wall with some artwork and diplomas. I have my lucky red lip on and a pink dress on. And then for a land acknowledgement, I currently reside on Lenni Lenape Native land, also known as Philadelphia. So welcome, I see you all sharing in the chat where you all are from. We're so glad to have you here with us. Please feel free to join in, welcoming each other, saying hello, connecting with each other in the chat. So just a little bit of our usual housekeeping. Of course, we ask that you please keep your microphones muted as you enter our room, so as not to interrupt or disturb the session or speakers. We encourage you to use the chat box for questions, comments, dialogue, connecting with one another. We encourage you to have the most recent version of Zoom for all of its different capabilities. For accessibility needs, we do have live transcription that's available for this event. To enable live captioning, please navigate to the meetings control bar and click the show captions icon. The session will be recorded for future reference as well as all of our other sessions. And we encourage you to join us on social media using the hashtag demystifyingTBP. Share your thoughts, your key takeaways, and your insights. Also, just want to make a brief note. We ask that you are mindful in your engagement in this session as we are talking about racial equity. This is a sensitive topic, and our intention is to host a non-harmful space as much as we can. And so just a reminder that this is not just a theoretical exercise, but this is also people's lived experiences and their humanity. And so we just encourage you in what you share and what you may say to be mindful of that and join us in trying to foster a non-harmful space. If you have any questions or anything that you're not sure about, please feel free. I invite you to message me privately or any one of the TBP staff members. If you have a question and you're not sure how harmful it may be or anything like that, you can always use the anonymous function by messaging us privately for that. Thank you. And of course, we have to shout out our amazing Trust-Based Philanthropy Project staff. This is an all hands on deck endeavor. And so just deep appreciation to the entire team for all of your effortless work. Again, these are the folks. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions, if you need anything. We're all here and ready to support and help. And for our series outline, of course, we are at the final session in this series, talking about what does racial equity have to do with trust-based philanthropy. And just as a reminder, all of the sessions are available. If you missed one, if you missed a part of one, the recordings are available on our website for that. And just as a reminder also what the series is about, we were really looking at addressing some of the common misperceptions, confusions around trust-based philanthropy. And one question we've gotten a lot is, what is the relationship between racial equity and trust-based philanthropy? We've got a lot of confusion about that, and so we're hoping this session will help to clarify some points for you all. So for today's agenda, of course, we're going to have our opening as usual. We'll have a little bit of grounding context. We understand people are coming from different places in the sector and in their journeys. So we just want to add a little context, and then we're going to have some speakers to come and share their perspectives, their experiences on this topic. And then we're going to have a breakout discussion at the end where we can reflect in deeper context on this information. We'll also have the main room available for open dialogue as well. And of course, we just have deep gratitude for all of our philanthropy serving organization partners that have partnered with us for this entire series. Again, they'll be hosting breakouts at the end of this session, so you can connect with them. And if you're not a member of any of these associations and you just want to enjoy their conversation, you're welcome to join in. We'll have the space for you to be able to do that. Or if you're not involved, you can always stay in the main room. So thank you again to our PSO partners. And so before we dig in, I do want to open us up with our opening poll. And again, this is really around, did it launch? Okay, there we go. Let's launch that. So this is really around the question, how confident are you that you can answer the question? Is it launched on your end? No. There we go. Okay. It just took a second to do it. So yeah, how confident are you that you can answer the question, what does racial equity have to do with trust-based philanthropy? So maybe you're very confident, and if somebody asked you that, you have all your talking points in order and know exactly how to clarify that. Maybe you have an idea, but you're here to learn more, get more clarity on it. Maybe you're not confident at all. If somebody asked you that, maybe it's a question you have yourself. Or if somebody asked you, you could not answer it clearly, and that's perfectly fine as well. And then also, we would love to hear which statement most aligns with your organization. Are you on a trust-based journey? Are you on a racial equity journey? Are you on both? Are you on neither? It would be great to hear where people are coming in or where they're at. And we have most folks saying they're somewhat confident. About 70% are somewhat confident in that first answer. And about 60% say they're on both a trust-based journey and a racial equity journey. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and share it out. I don't know, for some reason, Zoom is moving a little slow for me. So in case you can't see it, we have about 15% say they're very confident, about 70% say somewhat confident, and about 16% say not confident at all. So we've got a general bell curve there. And then in terms of where your organizations are, about 12% are on the trust-based journey, about 20% are on a racial equity journey, about 63% are on both journeys, and about 5% are on neither. So thank you for participating in that poll. That's always helpful for us to see where people are and get a little bit of a live evaluation going. This poll. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the grounding context. I'm going to invite my colleague Shadi up to partner with me on this portion. But just as a piece of framing before I pass it off, this is a complex question, of course, as is all of the sessions we've done, but this is a complex question. There are lots of layers, and we started out with just dumping everything and said, okay, what can we tackle in an hour and a half? So there's a lot more to come with this session, and this is just meant to be an introductory conversation. And so with that, I want you to keep that framing in mind. I know you'll probably have more questions, and we're hoping to answer those in future sessions and future programs. But that is our intention for this session, to give you some grounding, to answer that question, to understand the differences and the similarities. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Shadi.
Thank you, Shantias, and good day, everyone. Good to be with you. I am Shadi Salehi. I am the Executive Director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I am an Iranian woman with pale olive skin, long brown hair, and I'm wearing an orange dress with a leaf pattern on it. And I'm in my office with a blurred background. And I'm joining you from unceded land of the Ohlone people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. So to ground us a little bit, I wanted to take us back in time to 2020. You remember that year, pretty significant year for all of us. That was also the year that we launched the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And when we first launched, we really emphasized the 6 grant-making practices, including things like multi-year unrestricted funding and streamlined processes and being transparent and responsive. We heavily emphasized these practices as a practical way to alleviate power imbalances and to advance equity. And as the pandemic prompted many funders to shift their practices toward more trust-based practices, we quickly realized that trust-based philanthropy was becoming over-associated with these grant-making practices, and the values underneath and beneath this approach were getting lost in the story. And we had this assumed focus that all of this was toward advancing a more just and equitable society. But as the discourse really kind of focused in on the practices, it became clear that those core values were not necessarily clear to everyone. And in that same year, communities around the world began to stand up against structural racism in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And that was another significant moment in philanthropy where many foundations embarked intentionally on a racial equity journey to address the role of philanthropy in upholding structural racism. And as many foundations began to embark on that racial equity journey, they started to realize something. There was this realization that there was a need to invest significant time in repairing harm and building trust with communities of color that had been overlooked and ignored by philanthropy in the past. So this was the year, our launch year, where it became very apparent that trust-based philanthropy and racial equity are interconnected. And as the project, the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, it became an imperative that we needed to reinforce these interconnections. Next slide. So one way we did this was really getting clear on the values that undergird a trust-based approach, because the trust-based practices manifest differently in different organizations. They don't always look identical in the way these practices are deployed. But the common denominator of a trust-based approach is a recognition that these are the core values that drive the work. So we actually spoke to leaders of about 20 foundations that had been intentionally embracing and deploying trust-based philanthropy. And these were the values that rose to the top: work for systemic equity, redistribute power, center relationships, partner in a spirit of service, foster mutual accountability, and embrace learning. So as we got clear on these values, it became clear that this is an important way of reinforcing the purpose and the drive beneath trust-based philanthropy. And all of these values reinforce an orientation and a vision for philanthropy's role in supporting, amplifying, and working toward a more just and equitable society. And that's really the North Star for trust-based philanthropy. And working for systemic equity rose to the top as the first value in this listing for a number of reasons. Next slide, please. So this is one of the core values, working for systemic equity. And the reasoning behind this is the fact that philanthropy has historically contributed to systemic inequities, both in the way wealth has been accumulated, often through extractive labor practices or extracting the land, and also in the way that the dissemination of resources have been controlled. This has also perpetuated inequities in terms of who and what organizations have had more access and less access to philanthropic resources. So this is a fact of our sector that we must acknowledge if we're going to embrace and commit to both a trust-based approach and a racial equity journey. So we define working for systemic equity as recognizing the racial, economic, and political inequities in which we operate and taking an anti-racist approach to change practices and behaviors that perpetuate harm. And anti-racist here means making choices and behaviors to oppose racism, racist practices, and structural racism. So these become this becomes a core value of a trust-based.
I'm in a webinar.
Next slide, please. So a question that we have gotten is, well, why focus on racial equity within this frame of systemic equity? Shouldn't we just be talking about systemic equity broadly? And the reason why we focus in on racial equity is because there is evidence and proof and history that shows that systemic inequities are most pronounced along racial lines. So meaning if you look at all the data related to education, healthcare, political status, gender, the list goes on, every sector, every issue, the inequities are disproportionately high among people of color. So that's a fact, that data is showing up across the board. So that means that addressing racial inequity is inherently necessary for addressing systemic equity, because you can't have one without the other. The other reason why we focus on racial equity is that philanthropy is a white dominant institution. There's a history of violence in the way wealth has been accumulated, and also harm and distrust toward people of color in the way philanthropy has kind of been built and structured in terms of, again, what are the decision-making structures that have, open flows of funding to certain communities and denied and ignored flows of funding to other communities. The other reason why we focus on racial equity is that trust is inherently racialized. So there's been studies that show people are much more likely to trust when there is an air of familiarity with the person that they're interfacing with. And the truth of the matter is, philanthropy as a sector is predominantly white. There's been recent data that has shown that 92% of foundation CEOs are white, 83% of executive staff, and 68% of program officers. So we have to address racial equity in order to ensure that trust doesn't just get perpetuated toward nonprofits and leaders that feel familiar to a predominantly white sector. And these are essential components, one, to just understand that there are these facts and figures that really inform this analysis, and also that we can be truly equitable in developing trust-based relationships in our work. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this screen grab from research done by the Bridgespan Group, where they really honed in on two of the biggest factors that hold back philanthropy's quest for social change. And they both boil down to race. One is the need for philanthropy to understand the role of race and the problems that philanthropists are trying to solve. And two is the significance of race and how philanthropists identify leaders and find solutions. We'll share the link for this study shortly, and we'll also include it in the follow-up email. This came out of the research that Bridgespan and Echoing Green released in 2020 about racial disparities in the philanthropy sector. Next slide, please. So how does racial inequity manifest in the social sector? So first off, it's important to know that philanthropic systems have been modeled after banking and finance. These are industries that have a history of discrimination against people of color. And this is not just a historic thing. There's recent data in recent years that showed that banks, for example, are 5 times more likely to deny loans to Black business owners. This is recent data. So this is an expression of a structural racism in our financial institutions that have been kind of the inspiration for a lot of the design and structure of how philanthropy has been shaped in terms of how philanthropy operates. Also, organizations led by and for people of color experience significant disparities in funding. So this is just a sampling. There's tons of other data out there, but one of the most significant pieces of data that has come out that came out in 2020, and that was research from Echoing Green and the Bridgespan Group. Unrestricted assets of Black-led organizations are 76% smaller than those of white-led organizations. So just imagine kind of what that inhibits in terms of the ability for flexibility and innovation and being responsive to communities. And another kind of startling data point. Native American organizations receive only 0.4% of total philanthropic support. And that's from Native Americans in Philanthropy from 2020. Also, a lot of research shows just the leaders who lead these organizations, leaders of color, report higher levels of stress, burnout, and mistreatment when compared to their white counterparts. And you'll hear a little bit more data, recent data from the Ms. Foundation. Shonda Chapman will be sharing that reinforces that finding. Next slide, please. And I will hand it back to my colleague, Shantias.
Thank you, Shadi, for that grounding, that history of TBP and some of what made the priority for racial equity be so prominent, and just some of the data that's in the sector right now. So when done thoroughly and correctly, a trust-based approach, it helps to move towards a more equitable sector. It does in the practices, the culture assessment, but it's not explicitly identical to racial equity work. And we've heard questions around that. We've heard conflations, confusion. And so that's part of what we really want to express and make sure it's understood that trust-based philanthropy as an approach is not explicitly racial equity work, but it does require a racial equity lens. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we jump into that, I do want to jump into the distinctions, the similarities and the distinctions. And I won't dig too much into trust-based philanthropy, its definition, because we've been talking about that throughout this entire series. We have plenty of resources, but it really is that work to shift the sector, to prioritize power shifting, to advance equity, to build those mutually accountable relationships. And it's important in a trust-based approach to understand the ways that philanthropic practices, the way we operate, the way we work as a sector, how that harms communities. Understanding certain funder actions and practices and ways of being, and how that may harm the communities, the grantees that we're aiming to serve and to support. Trust-based philanthropy is a framework, of course, and it's also a mindset. It's a way of thinking and operating. Trust-based philanthropy, one of the facets is to lead with trust, to start with trust rather than distrusting your grantees, the community, to lead with trust. And we had a previous session in this series that spoke on what that looks like. We talk a lot about that relationship priority. This is a relational approach. We're lifting up ways to build stronger relationships between funders and grantees. And it really gets at that funder value practice gap. There's a gap between the practices funders, the values that funders say they have and how that is actually implemented, the practices that actually funders carry out. And then we also believe that trust-based philanthropy, a lot of the power imbalance, because of a lot of the power imbalance, the onus is on funders to make these shifts as the ones that hold that power. And then on the other side of things, racial equity is a goal. It's also a movement. Racial equity is very complex. Of course, as we mentioned before, there's way more than we could cover in this brief session, but it really looks at addressing and understanding and eliminating those disparities and improving outcomes, particularly for those that have been marginalized and disenfranchised. And it looks at the continual, the changing policies, practices, systems, and structures that we have at play, both as a larger society and in our sector. And so some of the facets of that include it being important to understand the ways that systems and practices have harmed and are harming people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people of color. This is also a goal and a mindset. It's a goal towards a more racially equitable sector in society. And so it's also a mindset. It's something that you could embed through all of your practices, processes, and all sorts of things you do. In a racial equity journey, trust may not be prioritized and it may never be achieved, especially when you consider all of the harms and injustices that have been done to marginalized racial identities. Maybe trust will never be the end goal, and it never will be achieved in a racial equity approach. Racial equity work is informed by demographics, understanding the data around the populations and the identities that are represented, that are supported, and those that aren't. And it requires scaffolded interventions. And when I lift up scaffolded interventions, I'm sure a lot of us have seen this image and maybe a longer one with justice and all of the other components of that. But when we think about what equity is and how it's defined, it means that certain populations that need more support get more support. It's not that everybody gets the same amount of support. It's that those that needed more get that. And so I thought this image would be great to really tie that scaffolded intervention component of racial equity work. And then the onus is on everyone in the racial equity approach. Everybody from wherever you're seated, whatever identities you have, can be on this journey and can find ways to bring others along and to lift up racial equity, lift up ways to be more equitable and to support marginalized identities, racial identities. And then when we look at both, there are a lot of similarities around both the trust-based approach and the racial equity approach. Both, of course, are working towards a vision of liberty and equity for the larger sector, for the larger society and for our sector. Both aim to address those inequities. They complement and rely on each other, which we'll talk about in just a moment, how they're interrelated. And both require both internal work, looking at your organization's culture, your practices, your hiring, your staff makeup, but then also that external work of looking at the communities you serve, who you're granting to, who you're not granting to, your strategic priorities and how those play out, how you're engaging with external constituents. And then for both processes, there's no universal approach. There's no one size fits all. A racial equity journey at one organization is going to look different than another one, and vice versa for trust-based philanthropy. So as I mentioned, trust-based philanthropy and racial equity are complementary. I mean, we talk a lot about this racial equity lens. In the trust-based approach, it is important to have that racial equity lens. And when I say a racial equity lens, I mean examining everything that you're doing and the ways you operate with racial equity in mind. So everything from examining the bias you may have internally in your organizations and your grant-making practices, to thinking about ways to uplift marginalized voices, to including others in the processes you do across the grant-making life cycle, across your organizational life cycle, through everything that you're doing, considering how racial equity can be uplifted, because there are ways for it to be ingrained across all of your processes. So this lens really helps not to perpetuate the same inequities. So if you're doing a trust-based approach, but you're still only serving those folks that you trust, those folks that aren't from racially disenfranchised identities, then you're perpetuating the same inequities. You're only serving those that are not being harmed by the system. This lens also helps to reduce that bias that I talked about and the harm to those that are most marginalized, to those that aren't getting the support from philanthropy, to those that are being disenfranchised by the sector. And it helps to acknowledge and right-size the lack of trust that Shadi was talking about, the lack of philanthropic trust towards BIPOC organizations and leaders. And then in a racial equity journey, trust-based philanthropy is a useful tool. So this is a tool that helps to give a framework and a language to operationalizing equity. So when you're on that racial equity journey and you're learning about the history of the sector and society and the ways that, foundations have perpetuated harm, then you can use trust-based philanthropy as a tool to right size and to fix and to address some of those injustices that you learn about. And it also helps to shift that data to action. So when you're learning about those data pieces, trust-based philanthropy is a whole framework. Of course, there's so many resources and ways that you can understand to operationalize this work. And it helps to address those power imbalances that we talked about between funders and grantees, grant seekers. It helps to address the value practice gap and all of those unnecessary requirements that we often make grantees do to reduce the harm that we're perpetuating towards them. So we encourage you to think of trust-based philanthropy as a means to an end. If your destination is a more just, equitable sector and society, trust-based philanthropy can be a vehicle for racial equity work. When you're on your racial equity journey, you're looking at things through this racial equity, if you're practicing trust-based philanthropy through this racial equity lens, this is a way for you to operationalize this work. So I encourage you all to reflect on your entry point and where you are, where your organization stands in this work. And yeah. And with that, I do want to transition over. We have 3 amazing speakers who are going to be sharing some of their perspectives, their expertise on the subject. So we have Jennifer Ching, who's the Executive Director of North Star Fund. We have Shonda Chapman, the Director of Innovative Grant Making and Research at the Ms. Foundation for Women. And then we have Gabriela Alcalde, the Executive Director at the Seawall Foundation. And first, I'm going to invite Shonda up to the main stage. And we're going to do things a little bit differently than we have before. For those of you that have been on other sessions, we usually have a panel, but we're going to have each of our speakers give a few slides, give some of their grounding, introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion at the end. So I'll invite Shonda to go ahead. Shonda.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the entire team at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project for convening us for this really timely and important discussion. Again, my name is Shonda Chapman, and my pronouns are she and her. I am a Black woman. I'm wearing a chartreuse dress and red lipstick that's not quite as fashionable as Shantia's lipstick, but I'm doing my best. Like she mentioned, I am the Director of Innovative Grant Making and Research at the Ms. Foundation for Women. I'm joining from Lenape Land in Brooklyn, New York. Ms. Foundation for Women's mission is to build women's collective power in the U.S. To advance equity and justice for all. We achieve this mission by investing in and strengthening the capacity of women-led movements to advance meaningful social, cultural, and economic change in the lives of women. In all of our work, we center women and girls and non-binary people of color. We listen to, trust, and uplift the voices of grassroots leaders closest to the issues. And in our most recent report, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment, it reflects exactly that goal. But first, you should know that I come to this work with a deep and abiding love for Black people, for people of color, for queer and trans communities, and broadly communities that have been marginalized. I have a deep commitment to social justice, and I believe in the power and ability of communities to dream and create the world that we want to live in. I identify as a Black queer woman, as someone who's been directly impacted by a variety of systems. I'm a parent, and I'm a 3rd-year doctoral student at the City University of New York. And we can go to the next slide. This September, my colleagues and I at the Ms. Foundation will release the next study in our Pocket Change series entitled Living with Pocket Change, How Women of Color Do More with Less. The study employs Black feminism and healing justice as a guiding conceptual framework to understand the impact of chronic philanthropic underinvestment on organizations led by and for women, girls, and non-binary people of color, as well as the people who lead them. One of the things we knew we had to do up front for an audience to even absorb the full breadth and depth of the findings was to first ground the data theoretically and historically, which can be difficult to do concisely but also because it's a challenging history and one that's difficult to contend with in a sector that concerns itself with helping. And while I won't go into this too deeply, it suffices to say that the origins of modern philanthropy are deeply intertwined with a really complex tapestry of social, economic, and political forces that have significantly shaped the landscape that we encounter today. In the US context, the emergence of modern philanthropy is really intimately connected with the country's history of racial inequity, and the oppression and the relationship between negative racial ideologies and stereotypes and the rise of philanthropy is really intricate. Throughout the history of American philanthropy, from the settlement house movement to the earliest grants given to organizations led by people of color, a clear pattern of bias and discrimination is evident. This legacy of exclusion has been particularly burdensome for women of color. From reform efforts of the early 20th century to present day, women of color have faced systematic marginalization within philanthropic spaces. And as a consequence, their leadership, organizations, and movements have borne the weight of historical neglect. Now, the impact of this history is not benign. The historical roots of racism and exclusion in philanthropy continue to shape the present day landscape of giving. Women and girls of color in the US are woefully underserved by philanthropy. Research suggests that not only do they receive fewer grants, they also receive smaller grants. In our initial pocket change research, which we conducted in 2020, we found that of the $66.9 billion given by foundations in 2017, only about 0.5% went to organizations by and for women and girls of color, averaging to about $5.48 per women and girl of color in the US. When it comes to unrestricted funding, as Shadi might have mentioned, which is considered the holy grail of financial support, the picture is even bleaker. With unrestricted support for Black-led organizations, 76% smaller than their white-led counterparts. And the stark disparity in unrestricted assets is particularly telling, as this type of funding often represents a proxy for trust. Several studies and our own research affirms that a culture of mistrust and even disrespect often permeates interactions between people of color-led organizations and institutional philanthropy. Next slide, please. As a foundation centering women and girls of color in our strategy and funding, Ms. Foundation has heard from activists and leaders we work with about how they continue to do justice work, regardless of whether it's supported by the philanthropic sector. And we hear how women of color are crucial to the future of our democracy. As a matter of fact, they are on the front lines of some of the most critical fights for justice, including reproductive autonomy, fights for queer and trans folks. They're literally sort of the backbone. They're like, the dam that's sort of holding up a cascade of really negative things for us, but they're not afforded the opportunities and the support that they should be. And it has been true throughout history. In this moment, Black and brown women are expected to do more with less. Building off the foundation's seminal research, our current report demonstrates how chronic disinvestment and underinvestment in leadership of women of color, as well as underfunding of the organizations they lead, takes a profound toll on leaders. Disinvestment and underinvestment impact women of color leaders on a personal level, the work their organizations can do and how they're able to interact to shape systems of wealth and power, such as philanthropy. This disinvestment and underinvestment take the form of short-term, small, and unrestricted grants that make it difficult for these leaders to recruit and retain skilled staff. The impacts are multiplicative and ultimately compromise their health, wellness, and sustainability to continue doing the work. Women of color leaders and their organizations continue to experience consistent barriers to foundation funding, including identifying opportunities relevant to the communities that they work in, as well as excessive administrative work for grant success. Our research found that, among other things, women of color leaders have really personal investments and connections to the work that they do and connections to the oppression that they seek to address. They are more likely to do cross-community work. They are often leading around innovative work structures, and they're more likely to invest time and energy in coaching and mentoring their younger peers. They're more likely to prioritize staff needs over their own. And they're also more likely to take a relational approach to their community work, which is very much long-term and hard to quantify. Next slide. The evidence suggests that women of color leaders are facing a crisis of burnout and mass exodus of movement leadership that threatens the stability of organizations and movements alike. And our study provides evidence that this crisis, burnout and movement exodus are not isolated individual events, but products of systems that continue to ask women and girls of color to work for mere pocket change. Ultimately, as a chorus of women of color leaders have been indicating, they are not funded to win. Next slide, please. I'm really liking this next slide thing. I wish I could just have this in all of my spaces, but we do what we gotta do. So what does this mean, right? What does it mean for funders? While it was a lot to hear and to hold, the findings were not all bad news. One of the most important findings of our report was, in fact, that trust-based philanthropic practices were actually making a difference in the experiences of our grantees. In fact, we'd recommend, if you don't do anything else, you should urgently adopt trust-based philanthropic practices like unrestricted funding, listening, prioritizing relationships, and being more aware of power dynamics. As for our grantees, they really did reduce the burden and make it easier to approach funders in times of crisis. However, our work finds that trust-based philanthropic practices are the floor. They are not the ceiling. Our grantees described a desire for a philanthropic ethos that builds on, but goes beyond trust-based values. So you do not get, there's no ticker tape parade coming for you if all you do is implement trust-based practices. You really actually have to develop a racial equity framework of your own, a gender justice framework. Our grantees described a vision for philanthropy that fundamentally repositions them in relationship to power and resources, one that values their humanity and is deeply committed to success on their own terms. So there are a few things that we, recommend in our report that you could do, practices that you could implement right away that would build, that would sort of get you on your journey. And of course, that is first that you implement trust-based philanthropic practices, but add ethic of care. And that includes naming intersecting oppressions and how they impact with power dynamics, how they impact power dynamics with funders, things like recognizing implicit bias, minimizing emotional labor and making intentional efforts, like Shadi mentioned, to shift power imbalances. Also, we recommend drawing from and funding healing justice approaches. The next thing we recommend is funding self-directed capacity building for women of color leaders and organizations, and that means proactively offering support. It includes things like earmarking additional resources for ad hoc requests and extending extra support to leaders in times of crisis. And if you don't provide capacity building, support intermediaries and public foundations and women's funds that do. We also recommend investing in women of color's wellness, power, and influence. And that includes consciously building the pipeline of new leaders, things like increasing representation of women of color in philanthropy, and asking for and working from a needs-based budget. Our research also, suggests that we can do things like helping grantees leverage new funding. Lastly, one thing you can do is also be working on things like building the evidence base and strengthening accountability. And these include things like aggregating and gathering more information and organizational resources for women of color-led organization, and tracking investments in capacity building and leadership development. And so before I close, I just want to wrap by saying that for us, trust-based philanthropic practices are a complement to and a framework for advancing a vision of racial and gender equity. They are not a substitute for a racial analysis or a gender analysis. You actually have to do that work. But once you do, trust-based practices are a wonderful and organic place to begin.
Wow, thank you so much, Shonda, for that really important research. We were so excited to invite Shonda here today to share a preview of Living with Pocket Change, which is a new research report coming from Ms. Foundation in September. So you all heard it here first, but more to come. Thank you, Shonda, for your leadership and leading that research and sharing those findings, and also for articulating this interconnection of the practices are just one part of a holistic approach. And really, if we want to advance a vision for equity, it requires prioritizing an ethos and a culture of care and justice that's rooted in these values, kind of in how we show up in everything that we do. So thank you, Shonda. We will bring you back for a short panel discussion after we hear from our other speakers. And next, I would love to bring up Gabriela Alcalde, who is the Executive Director of the Sewell Foundation based in Maine. And I think this is a great segue, really first hearing about kind of what does it look like to put some of this work in practice, but also hearing from you, Gabriela, as a funder that has committed to this intersectional work, but not necessarily focused explicitly on supporting, one specific community. So, I mean, well, you fund in Maine, but broadly, you're not kind of like an specific issue funder. So, well, and maybe you are. So actually, I'm going to stop talking and invite you to share with us, Gabriela, more about your work at Sewell and how you see the intersection of racial equity and trust-based philanthropy.
Thank you, Shadi, and thank you, Shonda. That was amazing. I'm really excited to see your report when it comes out. So my name is Gabriela Alcalde. I'm with the Sewell Foundation. I am a 50-year-old Peruvian woman, mestiza, with increasingly graying dark hair, wearing dark blue shirts and big silver earrings, and you can see lots of art behind me. I am dialing in from unceded Wabanaki territory, also known as Maine. I'm really excited and really honored to be on this panel. The relationship between racial equity and trust-based philanthropy is actually what led me to trust-based philanthropy. I felt it was a really useful bridge and a framework for trying to create the level of structural and cultural change that is really needed to do racial equity work and eventually to become an anti-racist organization. So as Shadi said, I think that the Sewell Foundation would not be thought of as a traditional racial equity funder. We fund in a wide range of issues. Our mission is very broad. It is about advancing the well-being of people, animals, and the environment, while really centering community and fostering equity. We also do this by recognizing the interconnectedness of all living things. And I often like to share that we do not believe that you can achieve equity unless you take an intersectional approach. And when we say intersectional, we say beyond humans. Equity really has to engage all life, and we have to address the planet that we live on, because it has also suffered because of white supremacy and its many progeny. We apply an equity lens to all of our programs and our operations. And since 2020, as you can see on this slide, we have had an amplified payout rate, specifically in response to the pandemic and the deepened racial inequities. And since 2022, we have used a multi-year grants budget, which is one of the structural changes that we've made to become more trust-based and responsive to our grantee partners. So as I go through, I'm going to try to share a little bit about sort of the multiple levels of trust-based philanthropy so that I can share how we have tried to really pull both lenses into our work. I think I already mentioned, but one sort of like assumption we have at Sewell is that white supremacy has caused harm to humans, to animals, and the environment. So it is necessary for us to adopt a racial equity lens to really advance our mission. So applying both trust-based philanthropy and racial equity allows us to address the roots of the harm and also get us on a road towards healing. I also want to recognize the historical and present-day presence of Indigenous communities in what is now Maine. At Sewell, one of our program areas is Wabanaki communities and tribal governments, where we focus on Indigenous-led efforts and tribal governments. It is really essential to understand that that is, in fact, international work because we're working with sovereign nations. So I just want to name that because that is somewhat different than other racial equity work because it is, in fact, international work. Next slide. So this little triad that you have here, over the last few years, we've really tried to identify there are lots of places where we draw inspiration and guidance and lots of frameworks and research that have really informed how we do our work. We really came to these three frameworks guide the way we operate. So it's emergent learning, trust-based philanthropy, and equity. We see these three frameworks as being interrelated and mutually supportive. So they support each other, they feed on each other, and they really enable each other. In many ways, applying these frameworks do something that Shadi, I've heard you say on many occasions, it helps us flip the script on traditional philanthropy, because these are pretty antithetical to the way that traditional philanthropy has worked. Using an emergent learning approach, we commit to learn as we go and to apply the lessons in real time. This allows us to be more responsive and adaptive to our grantee partners, to community needs and priorities, and to general social context. I will just parentheses, all of these are a lot harder to do. They are much more time intensive, they're much more resource intensive, and they are counter to the way that not just philanthropy, but institutions in the US are created and the way leadership is thought about. So my training is in public health. And one of the things that we often try to say is, oh, prevention is so much easier. It's not. And I'm not going to try to tell you that doing racial equity work or doing trust-based work or emergent learning is easy. It is not easy. It is hard and it is worth it. And when things are important and necessary, we should not have to rely on convincing people to do it because it's easy or fun. So I'm not going to pretend that it is. With trust-based philanthropy, we have a framework that really helps us engage at various levels of the work. It guides our commitment to anti-racism by helping us to engage at the culture, structure, leadership, and practices level. And through an equity lens applied internally and externally. And thank you, Shadi and Shintias, for the context setting at the beginning. I don't have to say a lot of things that I would have said otherwise because you guys said it all. But it really helps us to ask ourselves, how is power operating in every situation, and to aspire for mutual accountability. I'll go to the next slide. So as I said, this is hard work and it takes a long time. It is iterative work. At the end of 2021, our board adopted a set of equity principles. It actually took years for us to get here. So when I said that it's hard and it takes a long time, our board wrestled with adopting equity definition and equity principles for years. And after significant internal work, the board decided to adopt these set of principles rather than one definition, because they felt it was very complex and they really wanted to sort of address the full scope of what the board felt was important for us to deal with. Through these principles, we acknowledge that racism is embedded deeply in the scaffolding of US society. And because of our mission, we take a deeply intersectional approach to equity, one that is inclusive, as I said at the beginning, of not just humans, but non-humans and the environment. We understand now that prioritizing BIPOC-led efforts is simply not enough to advance equity. It is a very tiny part of it. We see equity as both a process and an outcome, and one that is iterative and ongoing. We don't foresee a time when we will ever end that work. And while trust-based philanthropy is extremely adept and helpful bridge onto racial equity journey, due to its values, the core commitment to explore how power is operating and its attention to the many dimensions of the work, including structure and culture, it just isn't enough. For too long, philanthropy has adopted and promoted race-neutral approaches. Race neutrality in the face of deeply embedded systemic racial injustices and structural racism is not neutral. It is not objective. It is not fair. In fact, I would say that a race-neutral approach is in fact harmful and willful denial of reality and the violence done to BIPOC communities historically and now. So I want to say that because I think a lot of times foundations might say, well, we don't work on racial equity, or we don't work with BIPOC communities. US society is racist. So if you are working within the US, you need to address racism. You need to be working on racial equity. Race neutrality is not neutral. Race neutrality is in fact a violence. White supremacy is alive in institutions, particularly ones that have built wealth from unjust and racist systems, and they have to proactively work to develop an equity lens. White supremacy thrives without us doing anything. So unless you're proactively working against it, you are going to be working within that, because that is the scaffolding that has been built. So I see trust-based philanthropy as creating a bridge for institutions who want some guiding framework for taking on racial equity work. And given the existing power disparity, I also believe it's important for funders to articulate their racial equity commitment and to work on that across all 4 dimensions of trust-based philanthropy. Again, those are culture, structure, leadership, and practices. Nonprofits may be fearful to be explicit about their racial equity commitments and work, given the current political landscape. So it really is incumbent upon funders to make their values clear and to make it safe for nonprofits to engage in this dialogue. Finally, I don't believe a foundation can truly and fully be trust-based if it does not engage racial equity work. At least it cannot be trust-based for BIPOC-led organizations. So if you want to be trust-based with all of your grantee partners in all the communities that you serve, as well as internally with all of your staff and board members and anyone that might work with you, you really have to also engage in racial equity work. Next slide. So this is this visual of one of very talented staff members that we have. We try to use a lot of visuals to communicate our values and our work. And in the first couple of years that I was with the foundation, we did a lot of talking about what is our racial equity journey? What does it look like? And we felt that it was really important to share that with others, to be transparent about how challenging it is, how complicated and complex it is, and how sometimes you feel like you're going backwards to go forwards or running around in circles because culture work is so difficult. There's a great article based from a book called Ideas, Arrangements, and Effects. And it talks about how deeply embedded ideas are in the arrangements and the structures, the designs that we have, and they can produce predictable effects. Racism is one of those ideas that is deeply, deeply built into the arrangements in US culture and institutions. So the effects that we have, the deep disparities that Shadi shared at the beginning, and that when you look at any sector in US society, whether it be education, health, public health, housing, employment, poverty rates, life expectancies, whatever you look at, there are deep racial disparities. These are predictable because of the ideas that we're built upon. So we really wanted to take this idea of how do you do this really complicated work and have a little visual. So in here, we talk a little bit about that initially there was an adoption of the commitment to equity being our North Star. There was then some effort to diversify board and staff. Often early in racial equity journeys, people, because it is the most quantifiable and easiest, most visible thing, people focus on diversity. We came to the realization as an organization, diversity is not the same thing as inclusion or belonging or equity. And so we needed to really look into everything we did. So we started looking at our operations, and we started creating tools for ourselves and engaging in dialogue to understand how can we truly be values-based? How do we take everything we do internally and externally and run it through a values lens? What does it look like to actually live your values? And how do you do that in a methodical way so that you're not pausing every time to talk for a few hours about everything you do? We also recognize that power seems so natural to us in its inequitable forms because we are such a deeply hierarchical society. So we started asking ourselves questions and creating tools and engaging conversations around how does power operate within the organization and how is it operating with our grantee partners with our applicants, with the communities that our grantee partners serve, and trying to become more community-centered and more community-driven. This led to layers of understanding, including the understanding that we have caused harm. We did a lot of training around white dominant culture and the difference between intent and impact. And I think that's a really critical piece to understand when you're doing racial equity work. You could have the best intentions, you could be the most kind-hearted humans in the world, but unless you are really focusing on the impact,
Give me 1 second.
then you're going to be missing a lot of the harm. And I think it's very important for healing to be able to happen, to be able to acknowledge harm that's been caused. And that was harm that, we talked about harm that was caused internally to staff and board because the culture was not yet ready for the diversity that the organization embraced. We also talked about the harm that we might have caused our grantee partners, our consultant partners, the communities that were served because of lack of understanding on our part. We have really been working on the culture, and we've done that through changing structures, through really understanding that power should be dynamic. So how do you move from this belief that power should always rest in certain areas to one that understands that power should be reflective of the level of responsibility and understanding. So those closest to the issue should have more decision-making power, and the power can be dynamic and shift through the organization depending on what you're doing. Finally, we recognize that all work is deeply relational. Relationships on their own do not heal things because you can have inequitable relationships. So again, just saying that something is relational does not make it not racist. So how do you bring a racial equity lens to that very relational engagement? I want to bring a little bit of a personal here too. I'm the first leader of color for the organization. And when you're talking about culture change, and thank you, Shonda, for sharing some of the work, and Shadi and Shantias for quoting some of the work from Building Movement Project, those reports were like salve to me, just reading that and knowing that I'm not the only one. There's so many women of color leaders who, not, again, the difference between intent and impact, but structures and cultures and our notions of leadership are not prepared for the type of leadership that the broad variety of people of color, and particularly women of color, where there's that intersectional of gender and race, ethnicity at play. So that creates some friction there. So I think trust-based philanthropy and racial equity need to really be applied internally as well as externally. It transmits when you don't have trust internally, that transmits to your partners, that it shows up in the way that you do your work, in the way you have relationships. So you have to have those hard conversations. You have to engage in the questions around how power is operating and the assumptions that we're each bringing to the table around power, around leadership, around what leadership looks like, and the ways that we manifest it. So finally, in closing, I just want to make sure we all understand the white supremacy and racism harms us all. A lot of times I hear people talk about at organizations, well, we don't need to do racial equity because we serve a majority white population. Maine is either the first or second highest white population in the US. And I've had people ask me, why are you doing racial equity work? Why do you care about that in Maine? Well, first of all, there are people of color in Maine, so let's not make them invisible. One, there's in the indigenous communities in Maine that have been here for thousands of years. So let's not erase that history and that current day existence of those communities and those tribal governments. There have also been Black people in Maine for a long time. So just because the population is small, I think people tend to almost erase that and say, we don't need to do that. Second, white supremacy and racism harm white people too. My understanding of white supremacy and racism is that it dehumanizes us. So we want to work against racism, whether you are engaging directly and predominantly with Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led efforts or not, because it is a healing approach and a healing journey for all of us. And we're trying to change the institutions. We are part of a broader sector, broader institutions, and overall society in the US, which it has racism embedded so deeply in it. So my last point would be that racial equity work is necessary for all funders and all nonprofits, no matter where you work, what your mission or program areas are. And without intentional anti-racism work, the default setting will be white dominant culture and white supremacy, and that will be harmful to all of us.
Gabriella, thank you so much for that really rich and thoughtful overview on the journey at the Sewell Foundation. We will bring Gabriella back up after we hear from Jen Ching from North Star Fund, our next speaker. And Jen, I'm just going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself and share about how you at North Star Fund really see this intersection of racial equity work and trust-based philanthropy. So take it away, Jen. Thanks for being with us.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to all the speakers thus far. My name is Jen Ching. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Yes, yes. Okay. There's a lot of like weird construction ambient noises happening here. My name is Jen Ching. My pronouns are she and her. I am an East Asian woman sporting a very awkward short haircut. I'm wearing a black t-shirt, and I have the weary look of a parent whose 2 children are homesick today and not attending their highly overpriced extractive summer camps. I am seated in front of a poster, one of my favorite posters of the labor activist, Joe Hill. I've been the executive director of North Star Fund for 6 years. We are based in New York, and we support work largely in the 5 boroughs of New York City and the Hudson Valley. And I'll talk a little bit about our work. But I wanted to just first open with some gratitude to Shonda, to Gabriella, for sharing both the imperative and the processes, like really opening both your research and your sort of internal foundation process to this audience, because it's so important, I think, for us to attach real facts and understanding, and also the real challenges. And like, here is like actual things we can do. And thank you so much, Shadi and Shantias, for laying that framework for us. I think I'm going to bring us, try to bring us a little bit more now into like, so what happens when things are all adopted? Like what then are, what is the lived experience, if you will, of a foundation in this journey, which never ends? I would never say, oh, North Star Fund, we got A+, we're done. We are trust-based. We got the seal of approval. You know, we wear it on our t-shirts. You know, it's an ongoing, iterative, conversational process. But while I think we have spent, and necessarily so, much of this conversation focused on the urgency, the difficulty, the challenges. I was noting in the chat that conversation about like, how are we hiding the spinach around very difficult and uncomfortable conversations? I hope that after, you know, we share a little bit of our process, you also all can feel the joy, the sort of liberatory transformation, the idea that we can do this very difficult work in cross-class, multiracial, deeply diverse spaces and come out of it, each and every one of us, transformed with renewed and different commitments to whatever our work and our priorities may be. Sorry, it's very loud here today. And I think, and you know, and I just want to share as the outset sort of my just like call to action that this is the sector that can do this work right now. You know, everything that our speakers have shared so far about sort of the centrality of race equity to, and the necessity of sort of building and deepening trust-based accountable relationships, right? Arguably that applies to every sector, not just philanthropy, nonprofits, you know, justice work, et cetera, but it applies to every aspect of our lived lives. And I would say philanthropy, this is our chance in the wake, particularly of the onslaught of movement from the right and in the recent Supreme Supreme Court decision, like we live in times where the very words that we have shared on this call are in deep jeopardy. And we operate in a field that has never really been too comfortable with doing things when the word jeopardy is in practice. So bravery is necessary, and who else but our field has the privilege and the luxury to be able to take on this work so significantly. So I have to apologize. As you can see from this standstill slide, I did not get to prepare my slides in time for today's call. I'd like to blame the 2 sick kids, but it was just purely me. So I'm going to just drop 2 links in the chat here, and these are just one is the statement of our values, because I do really enjoy sharing out how we have created tools that operate, that sort of like our operating documents and structure. And then just like a scroll through kind of snapshots, you can see how these values kind of are lived through our work. And I'll just walk through those conversations in the next few minutes. North Star Fund. So first of all, like very simply, what do? So we basically raise money. We are a public foundation. We do have a very small endowment, but it's not really an operative endowment. We have been around for about 40 odd years. We were founded in 1980 by a group of New Yorkers who saw the sort of a significant financial crisis in the city, the municipal crisis of the 70s, and said, you know, we don't want to see this and continued underinvestment in grassroots work in New York. And so we would like to not actually open our own family foundations, but we want to, you know, turn the idea of a foundation on its head. And so for 40 years, that has been our clarion call as to how can we turn the idea of a foundation on its head. We basically support grassroots organizing that's led by communities of color building power. And we do so through a specific system and design that we facilitate of shifting power so that all the money that we raise goes into the hands of essentially our grantees, of grassroots organizers who are doing the very work that we support. I shared in the chat our values so that you can just sort of see, and I won't sort of, you know, read them all out loud here, but we have a set of values that are really the operating instructions for our organization. And the first value is the idea that when Black and Indigenous communities and people of color communities really lead, and when we center the leadership, and you've heard this from some of the other speakers today, but for us, this is the practice, when we center the leadership of the communities with the most proximate relationship to injustice, then we all win, and we want to all win. So that is first and foremost our operative value. We then have 2 twin values, which is the idea that dignity and self-determination is available to all, and that solidarity is an everyday practice, meaning we are a community of practice. We are not a community of we said so's, ha ha, you're not cool enough to join unless you use all the right jargon. You know, we are an invitational, open, expansive community. We want you to be here. We want to meet you where you are, because solidarity is an everyday practice, and we want you to be in practice with us. And then our last operative value is probably the one that is, as Shadi and Shantias were sort of saying in the beginning, the one that's sort of most affiliated with the language of how a lot of people understand trust-based philanthropy, which is that we strive to fully and responsibly resource movements. So we think about what is responsibility in our role as a funder. These values compel us to really sharpen our work in 3 ways. The first is, you know, if given this framework of values, it makes us focus on what we fund. And so at North Star Fund, we are not issue specific. So we fund across the spectrum of housing, immigration, LGBTQ rights, you know, and any issue that is of salience to a growing movement. We are sort of an early stage funder. But what we focus on is funding systems change, identifying work that emanates from the grassroots. So multi-issue, single discipline, I would say, right? The discipline of people mass building together a community identified and led solution. The second area in which how our values sort of transform our work each day is how we fund, right? As I mentioned before, by making the decision that we will think and apply these values to everything we do, it means that we operate at any given time 3 or more community funding committees that are comprised of volunteer organizers who not only make our grant making decisions, but participate in the governance and the strategy development of our organization. And we have other sorts of volunteer committees throughout the organization that are part of our governance, including our finance committee, and so our board and our staff, we are of course the fiduciaries and the officers of the organization, but we are facilitating and in relationship and accountable to a range of, I would not say outside, but community-based leaders. It's tremendous to participate and work in this way. Thank you so much for uplifting the power shifting model for the slides. It is about intentional creation of community and moving towards a design of, what does it actually mean in practice to not just shift and cede power, but to see what that shifted power can create and focus. Finally, the third way in which our operative values really impact our work is in how we fundraise. We are, as a public foundation, and I'm sure there are many community foundations on this call today. I think community foundations were often the hardest to implement and think about trust-based strategies and to think about race equity work, because there is a concern about how the larger community which feeds our work will view these complicated questions, right? But we view ourselves as organizers, and we are a community that tries to be as transparent as possible, that we're not just looking for your gift, we're looking for your participation. We want people to not just give to North Star Fund, but we want them to change their giving generally towards social justice movements, and we want them to change their giving manner generally towards trust-based practices. And so we offer, as being a community of solidarity and practice, a place for people to give through and to participate in a transformative journey themselves towards becoming not just more responsible funders and donors, but also becoming skilled in being agents of change so that they are comfortable to go out there and steward difficult conversations. They are comfortable being transparent about what they have met as challenges, as you heard from Gabriella and Shonda, that they can talk and reach more people, because we are not going to do this work if we continue to stay in closed silos. This question, of course, about sort of I don't want to sort of repeat what the others have already said, but when we sort of ask about why is the race equity lens so central to trust-based philanthropy? For me, the question is, in addition to sort of what I've shared about how we work and our sort of operative values, the question really is when, we do not just say race equity, stop, right? The question is the question of the lens. And for us, it is a literal lens, meaning we are in constant, disciplined engagement and conversation, between our operating decisions and our values. It's a dialogue of accountability that is continual and hits all the areas that Gabriella shared in her slides, right, around culture, leadership, process, right? So it is the single filter by which we are making decisions. And when people say race equity, I understand people say, well, why race equity? Why not all equity, right? And as the speakers have already said, right, race equity is the shorthand for the looking at the series of deeply disparate relationships and power holding, and centering the question of who and how can we lift up to create a different sort of practice and power. And what that means for us also in terms of how we've come to define trust beyond just our grant making or our personnel policies or the way maybe we talk about work, is that it means for each of us who participate in North Star Fund, we have a larger and open question and conversation about the deepest rooted issue here, which is money and trust overall, right? That we are here to kind of dismantle all of the ways in which the white supremacist practices that the other speakers have said, but like just exist in us all the time. Like one thing that I always like to remind folks is people have this vision. They say, oh, North Star Fund, of course, they center, you know, Black, immigrant, people of color leadership. So of course they're going to have radical grant making, right? Because that's just the way, that's of course, yeah, that it's a given. It's not a given. And the thing that I always say in settings like this is if you give any group of people money, they will have challenges because we all have to be unwired. We have all of us have so much to unlearn around distrust and money and power. And so it's a discipline for all of us to participate and to really understand our relationship with gatekeeping and knowledge hoarding. And nowhere is that even more apparent than when you deeply democratize systems and power. And so finally, I just want to close by sort of sharing that at the end of the day, you know, our model, our power shifting model centers the relationship between race, equity, and trust-based philanthropy. But it is never a complete, as I said before, it's never a complete circle for us, right? There is always a space for us to be rethinking things, trying things, and that I think goes to the deepest and most significant cultural shift that trust-based philanthropy can bring, which is comfort with the discomfort, with change, experimentation, the willingness to try something, the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to be transparent and take accountability. We have made not good decisions, and we have been accountable to the people who we are in relationship with and the institutions. We are learning, and that is, I think, really one of the best aspects of our own unlearning, right, is to be transparent about shifts and challenges that we experience in this journey.
Wow. First of all, can we just give it up for all of our amazing speakers for sharing so many gems of wisdom in a really tight time frame that we gave them. Thank you to Shonda, Jen, Gabriella. And we wanted to just kind of bring all three of you back up for a super brief lightning round panel discussion. And we'll take it off the slides for a moment just so we can take a look at everyone. And wow. There's so much to unpack, but I'm going to just bring one question to each of you that I hope you can answer succinctly, because I know that our participants on the panel or in the webinar today are also probably eager to connect with one another and unpack some of what you all shared today. I want to start with you, Gabriela. A question for those who are, and I want to kind of place the range of audiences we have on today's discussion. And I'm going to bring a question to each of you, kind of acknowledging that. Gabriela, for those who are on the call today that are just, they're new to the racial equity conversation, like it's not actively happening in their organizations, the organization doesn't identify as a racial equity organization, maybe the mission is broad, like Sewell's mission. What is your advice for engaging the board in seeing the need for not just getting the conversation started, but embarking on this journey? What guidance do you have for those who are looking for ways to get this conversation started?
That's such a good question. And I think it really depends on your board. I think different groups of people, just like different individuals, boards have personalities and ways of learning. So I think if you have a board that's really focused on metrics, you might want to bring some of the data that you shared and that Shonda shared from her report. So bring some facts if that's going to be the most persuasive. If stories are the way, if it's a more sort of like emotional response group, then gather some stories. There is so much literature out there right now that there's zero chance that anyone could effectively, well, there are lots of chances that people would try anyway, but zero chance that you would like effectively be able to argue that there are no racial disparities in this country and that philanthropy is not significantly contributing to it. Even if you just start with the facts that you shared, Shadi, around philanthropic staff, boards, and leadership, I'm an immigrant. I'm a Latin American immigrant. And so I represent, like, I think 2% or 1.6% is all Latinos. That's US born and immigrant, foreign born like myself, male, female, like all Latinos bunched into one is less than 2%. So obviously that's going to shape the decisions we make. And there's good research around racialized philanthropic decision-making, that when you have leaders of color, they are much more likely to make decisions to fund and support BIPOC-led organizations. And that's some of the familiarity pieces that you talked about. So I think that they're, depending on what your board's way of learning and engaging, what they value the most is, seek out those resources, reach out to peer funders who work in a similar way to you, who are maybe further along that, and have conversations. I would highly encourage boards to also work, and organizations to work with a facilitator who can help them have these challenging conversations. Because as Shantia said at the beginning, and I really appreciate you naming it, these are difficult conversations. The US does not have a culture that is very comfortable with talking about racism, even though it's so deeply embedded. And so, significantly featured in our history and our current day reality. People are very uncomfortable with it. People mistake discomfort for lack of safety. And so when they get this uncomfortable, they think they're being attacked. And that is, again, normal human reaction. So working with someone that can help you frame those conversations so that you don't cause harm. I've seen a lot of places where especially staff of color and sometimes board members of color are invited to share personal experiences. That can be extremely traumatizing, re-traumatizing. So I would say, please work with people who have experiences in holding space for these conversations. Don't try to dive into the deep end without life vest and a rope to pull you back out. And reach out. I mean, there are a lot of organizations doing this work, so please reach out. I think this is work best done in collaboration.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and thank you for mentioning that there are a whole range of resources out there. We will follow up after this with the sources of data that we shared, as well as some suggestions of organizations that can support your organization's journeys in this way. Shonda, coming to you, a question that's coming up for me is, for funders who are listening in today, who either maybe already fund organizations by and for women of color, or are looking to build relationships there, what is your advice? What should they be considering as they, approach those grant-making relationships?
Oh my God, so many things. It's difficult to even know where to start, especially after we've had such a wonderful and rich conversation. I think one of the first things one would do, is like really sort of deepen your understanding of intersectionality. This first and foremost. So like, having a really deep analysis around power and privilege, the ways that intersecting identities show up. And then based on the results of some of our reports, a lot of what you might do is invest in filling some of the gaps. When you think about building movements research, when you think about some of the other research that really talk about the historical deficits, I think that beyond traditional grant making, it really becomes imperative to think about capacity building resources, and of course, self-determined capacity building resources. And I would say, in light of, I'm worried about the burnout, actually. Almost all of our grantees, and not like the burnout that's like, oh, I'm a little tired, a weekend of rest, that fixes it. Like profound, I might leave the sector. I don't know how, I'm unwell, there are crises in my, like that sort of burnout, like it is impossible, especially in this moment where I don't know about all of you. I'm terrified. I turn on the news. I watch what's happening in the world, and I worry, you know, about where we are. And I'm doubly worried when I recognize the way that we are not investing in the wellness of the people that are actually on the front lines of these really big fights. I think that we give more attention to like the copiers and the printers, like they get, you know, maintenance on very regular schedules. They're taken offline, you know, but the same can't be said by, you know, about the women of color leaders. So I would say all of those things, but really making it one of the things that we did in our most recent RFP for the Activist Collaboration Fund was we added care to signal both to our grantees and to the field this really deep commitment to resourcing care and to making sure that people knew that that was an option. They didn't have to decide between getting funding for you know, programmatic things, but they could actually submit to us a proposal that was just about rest or sustainability or safety or some infrastructure that would support care. So I know that that was not one answer, but a couple of things.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Jen, on to you. You know, you really are kind of already working at this intersection, but you've communicated and shared that this is iterative work. What is your advice for those who are, and we have like 60% of the people today are both actively working on trust-based philanthropy and racial equity? What is an area of focus that folks should be considering that you've noticed that maybe doesn't get the attention it deserves when you're operating at this intersection?
You know, I think let's just get to like the real meat of it, what was in the chat, which is the idea, as it I think has often been in most sectors, that the staff is ahead of the executive leadership, is ahead of the board. And what you end up creating are these hierarchies of workarounds. So there's like cultural change perhaps being felt throughout the organization, but for deeply different intention, motivation, and outcome at every level, with each level of the hierarchy sort of seeking to protect or work around the perceived limitations of the other level of the hierarchy. So I think that in order for trust-based philanthropy, and I can't remember who said this earlier, but first of all your messy laundry is not private. Everybody can see it. Everybody talks, you know, and just because your grantees submit a survey and say, oh my gosh, they're the best funder ever. Hello. I have submitted that survey myself. So it's really important for us to acknowledge, I think, that part of this journey is the opportunity to move everyone towards a common framework and understanding, and to accept that people may be in different places with how they implement the understanding, but a good first goal is that those who are at different levels will not serve to obstruct the sort of vanguard or the future or the exciting implementation in the work, which is why I had closed with sort of the idea that you need to be comfortable with a culture that defines risk and experimentation and change differently, to be receptive towards these things as a culture of practice. What does that really mean in real life institutions where I think for, you know, some percentage of people on this call, your boards will never move. And so you are trying to steward your responsibility towards money and social justice urgency in the best way that you can. Well, then I would say, then do your best to kind of move and develop the language and the practice of your organization to strengthen. I think most of the time when I work with unwilling or uncomfortable trustees, they see that the ships are moving. And the challenge is that they just don't feel like they understand and are connecting with these things. So as Gabriella said, there are facilitators, there are places of learning, et cetera. But the most important thing is to give folks something that is really exciting. And I know I say this and I don't mean to make light of it, but exciting and joyful to work towards. Like one of the things that we have talked a lot about at North Star Fund is that we don't want to solely talk about our work through the lens of fronting our grantees. So we don't just sit around and be like, you should, fund our work because, we just won, some grantee that we just supported just won this victory around childcare, right? I do, absolutely. Like it's important. But we have shifted our own conversations with folks to say, like, you should support this work and be a part of our community because it is transformative. And wherever you are on the journey, our practices are here to help you inform and learn from that. And we're a place where you can practice and be uncomfortable, and it's okay. I really don't know that we will get out of the circularity of why what we talk about when we talk about trust-based philanthropy is not race equity until we confront that sort of tiering of the relational power in organizations.
Such important and brilliant points. Thank you to our amazing panel. We really appreciate you for sharing all these insights and stories and perspectives. I'm going to hand us back to Shantius Ford to move us along to the next portion. We're running a little behind, so I'm going to stop talking and Shantius will take us away.
Thank you, Shadi, and thank you so much to Jen, Gabriella, and Shonda. Oh man, I wish we could keep the conversation going. I'm really sad that we have to go ahead and move along. And I'm not going to talk through these key takeaway points because of the sake of time. I also just launched a closing poll. It'd be great to hear how confident you are now that you've had a chance to hear more of the nuance around the correlation and the distinction. But yeah, I encourage you all, we're going to share out these slides. I encourage you all to dig into the key takeaways. And we also have a slide on what you can do, whether you're starting from a trust-based approach, whether you're already on that racial equity journey, or whether you're on both tracks. And if you're on neither track, there's also plenty of entry points for you to think about. Check out our self-reflection tool, check out any of the resources we've been sharing. We encourage you to share those, the recordings, different things like that. Lift these points up, lift these thoughts up in your conversations with your team, and start to think about what would make most sense. Our speakers have given plenty of really great advice and ways to really start this journey if you're not already on that. So we encourage you to dig into that. And the poll, we have about 60% that are very confident now and about 40% that are somewhat confident. And again, this is just the entry point. So we encourage you to continue to dig into this work and understand it a little bit deeper. So with that, I do want to offer deep thanks to all of you for being here with us today, for the conversations in the chat, for engaging. Of course, another round of gratitude for our amazing speakers. And we're going to jump into some discussions at this point. We're also going to drop that evaluation in the chat. Please take a second to fill that out. It's very helpful for us as we design future iterations of programming. And on that, be on the lookout for future iterations. This conversation is not over. And we definitely have plans in the works to keep this conversation going, particularly around the intersection between racial equity and trust-based philanthropy. So yeah, we'll open up the breakout rooms for continued discussion. If you're not a part of a PSO, you're welcome to stay in the main room with us. We'll be discussing this further. And yeah, thank you all so much for your participation and engagement.